Hi guys, today I'm going to be talking to Amit S. Bagga. He's a candidate in the Council District Race 26, which covers Sunnyside, Long Island City, Woodside, and parts of Astoria. Amit, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Christian.
Great. Well, listen, many people know you in the district, but, if there are those that don't, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're running for office?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here today. It's really great to join you.
Yeah, thank you.
A little bit about me. So I'm a native New Yorker. I was born and raised right here in New York City in a middle-class neighborhood, not so dissimilar from Sunnyside.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a proud product of New York City's public schools, and I'm also very proud to be queer and South Asian.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm running here in this district because I know that New York City can once again offer the promise to all New Yorkers of living their lives with opportunity, with dignity, and in a way that we can build power together. My parents were immigrants from India, and they came to the United States, to New York City, with very little. And New York City at the time really did offer them this promise. And it gave them the opportunity to build a life that they were able to live in a thriving way and with dignity. And it gave me immense opportunity as well. And I think even before COVID, despite the fact that we seem to think that we have this sort of very strong economy and very low unemployment, the reality of the economy in New York City, even prior to COVID, is that it was an economy divided.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of wealth that was being generated right at the very top. And even though there was, in fact, a lot of employment, a lot of that employment was truly at the very bottom. And when you look at the people who were excluded from the economy, it was immigrants, it was low-wage workers, it was freelancers, artists, and it was also immigrant small business owners. And collectively, these are the people who not only are the workforce of New York City, but when you look at the case of small business owners, also truly employ the workforce of New York City. 2/3 of New Yorkers were employed by small businesses prior to COVID hitting.
Mm.
And so despite what we saw, or what may have seemed to us like a really strong economy, the reality is that too many people did not have access to economic stability, economic mobility, growing into having more stable and thriving lives. And certainly this was desperately so the case for our neighbors who are Black, brown, and immigrants, including queer and trans New Yorkers as well. So my vision for New York City, as we enter this very critical stage where we are facing anywhere from a $7 to $9 billion deficit, is that we need leadership that is not only truly bold and progressive, but also is sufficiently experienced in knowing how to pull and push every single lever of government to make sure whatever money we do have left is in fact working for each and every single one of us and working for our working families.
Okay, terrific. Just keeping on the local level, how long have you lived in the district? What is your current involvement, in terms of local things within the Sunnyside, Woodside, LIC areas at present?
Sure. So I've been in the district for 4.5 years. I moved to Sunnyside in 2016, and I'm a very proud resident of Celtic Park here on the south end of Sunnyside. Really beautiful community, really incredibly diverse, and it is truly an honor and a pleasure to live in a community as diverse as this. I think a community that is this diverse truly embodies the spirit, is the very quintessence of New York City, of Queens. And it's really been a pleasure to be here. In terms of my involvement locally, for the last 13 plus years, nearly 15 years, I've been very involved in Queens politics and doing work on behalf of the people of Queens, generally speaking. Over the course of this time, I've helped reunite hundreds of immigrant families right here in Queens that were torn apart by the Bush immigration system. And the bulk of my work over the last several years has really been focused on uplifting low-income immigrants and consumers, many of whom really are in Queens and also are in this district, in Sunnyside, in Nypd, and also in Woodside. Things that I've accomplished, like getting IDNYC accepted for banking purposes, helping to implement the nation's largest and most comprehensive paid sick leave law, writing, passing, and implementing brand new labor protections never before seen here in New York City, such as bringing fair and predictable schedules to fast food workers and bringing protections to freelancers, the first ever such law of its type in the nation. These are ways in which I have truly been working inside government and also outside government to really uplift and protect our neighbors right here in this district.
So, Amit, tell me a little bit about the New York City Fair Economy Fund. I was doing some reading and I saw that you're putting forward such a concept. Just tell people a little bit about that.
Sure. It's a great question. The goal of the Fair Economy Fund is to truly start to fund all of those millions of New Yorkers that have been left out of the economic growth that we'd seen prior to COVID, and make sure that as we build our recovery, that immigrants, workers, freelancers, and small business owners, not Wall Street, are really at the heart of that recovery. So starting with just 1.1%, just 0.1% of the city's budget, approximately $85 million, the Fair Economy Fund seeks to do a couple of things. Building on a first of its kind model that I created to run the 2020 census campaign, had never been done before in the city. What we can do with the Fair Economy Fund is significantly expand linguistic and cultural capacity at community-based organizations and at local community development financial institutions to ensure that we are arming immigrants, workers, and small businesses with the tools they need to become economically stable, and also begin to once again participate in the economic recovery that we will be having. So how does this work? The folks that would be hired would be linguistically and culturally competent New Yorkers, people from the community, our neighbors, who are focused on training immigrants on their rights in the workplace and their rights in the marketplace. Far too often, one of the reasons that we see that immigrants, irrespective of status, end up being taken advantage of and exploited either as workers or as consumers, it's because they don't know their rights. And so making sure that we are providing that training in linguistically and culturally competent ways is a cornerstone to making sure that we are empowering immigrants to fully participate in the economy. In addition to that, as we are building towards an economy where we're going to need a completely new set of skills to be able to be prepared for the economy of tomorrow, whether that's retrofitting boilers or windows, to make sure that we're greening our buildings, et cetera, we're going to make sure that the workforce of today, as well as the incoming workforce of tomorrow, is actually being trained on these new skills. The Fair Economy Fund can assist with that training. In addition, immigrant small business owners and small business owners of all types, these are people, with small businesses that are fewer than 10 or fewer than 5 employees, bodegas and coffee shops and local businesses that folks that we go visit to all the time, and folks in our communities own and operate. For too long, the federal, state, and city programs that have been designed to really support these businesses, and an example of this is the PPP program that Congress passed earlier this year, the dollars from those businesses end up going to support businesses on Madison Avenue instead of Greenpoint Avenue. And one of the key reasons for this is because small business owners are just too busy. They are, being crushed under the stress of unregulated commercial rent. They're being crushed under the stress of the fact that people have a lot less disposable income now, given the economic situation. They don't necessarily have all the tools in their toolbox to know how to apply for these loans and grants, how they function, and what they can actually do with this money. And so I want to make sure that the Fair Economy Fund is expanding capacity at local community development financial institutions. These are local banks that small businesses work with all the time. To also make sure that these small businesses are being connected to the loans and grants that are actually being designed to support them, but often don't reach them. And in addition to this, one very important goal that the Fair Economy Fund is going to accomplish is making sure that a very, very, very important group of workers in our city, who are city's taxi drivers, are finally made whole. As I know a lot of New Yorkers are aware, the taxi industry is facing a just completely unconscionable crisis. Thousands of taxi drivers across the city are dying under crippling debt that they cannot possibly afford. And it in fact is the fault of the city of New York that we have the situation on our hands that we do. The city of New York created the secondary market that allowed for taxi medallions to be sold in the way that they were. The city of New York failed in sufficiently regulating that market. It allowed those taxi medallions to completely overheat in value, and it allowed the medallion market to collapse. And essentially what you have is tens of thousands of immigrant New Yorkers, taxi drivers who keep the city moving, who came to New York City because New York City offered this promise of opportunity, dignity, and power to them. And now literally we have taxi drivers who've committed suicide and who are crippling under debt they're never going to be able to pay off. So the Fair Economy Fund, its number one job is going to make sure that we can start to guarantee the outstanding debt and build towards making sure that we have ways to really relieve drivers of that debt as it continues to grow. Another really important feature of the Ferry Economy Fund is that, with this very small investment of just $85 million in taxpayer funds, 0.1% of the city's budget, we can also challenge the philanthropic sector to really pony up and do their fair share. This is really important because the state constitution, prohibits the city of New York from doing certain things, but it doesn't prohibit the private sector from doing certain things. And when we're talking about, immigrant families that have undocumented members, when we're talking about freelancers who are, out of work for sometimes 3 or 6 months at a time, when we're talking about small business owners who've seen their revenues just completely flatline, these are people who perhaps weren't always necessarily on the brink of economic collapse, but truly are now. And as a result of either law or neglect or a complete lack of political will, don't necessarily have a way to become economically stabilized. If we were able to attract $85 million in philanthropic support, the same amount that we're putting in taxpayer dollars, that money can be used to start to provide direct financial assistance to families who so desperately need it and who otherwise don't qualify for participating in our social safety net. Right. And so together, this Ferry Economy Fund can really work to start to stabilize our neighborhoods economically and allow us to get to a place where we can, in fact, start to find economic mobility and build an economy that includes everybody and truly is, serving the people of.
Okay, just one last question on the fund. How would you entice the philanthropic groups to donate, so to speak?
So much of this is about political will. I'll give you a very good example. We have these 3 funds that the City of New York has set up. One is called the Fund for the City of New York, one is called the Fund for Public Health, and one is called the Fund for Public Education. And over the life of these funds, somewhere between 10 to 15 years, they've attracted hundreds of millions of dollars of private funding. And why is this? It's because the City of New York, with the imprimatur of the mayor, said, these are issues we care about. We care about significantly improving the overall public health of New Yorkers. We care about finding new and innovative solutions to our challenges in the public education space. And so by putting, when you have the imprimatur of the city and you're saying the city is going to put political will behind this, you're essentially sending a signal to the philanthropic community that, yes, this is something we care about. And the city is going to partner with you to make sure that this is a success. Because, for them, that's a really big question. They want to know, is there going to be real leadership behind whatever it is that you're proposing? And so the simple act of putting the stake in the ground and demonstrating that leadership really starts to change the way that some of our external partners treat this very important issue. And by the way, they themselves are looking for new and innovative ways to really address the crisis of excluded workers, right? The philanthropic sector right now is actually more flush with cash than it has been in a while, despite the economic crisis. And they really need to they're looking for partners in government to say, guide us on what is good public policy so we can do our part to ensure that we are being the best partners we can.
Great. Okay, now let's get to the local stuff. There's a lot of land use issues in terms of rezonings. There's a few that are being looked at now. How would you approach land use issues if you were to be council member?
Sure. So in general, I think a couple of things on this issue. Number one, we as a city, and certainly Sunnyside, Woodside, Long Island City, and Astoria, have suffered as a result of there being a lack of comprehensive planning and leadership about the direction in which the city needs to be going as far as the use of our land. Obviously, I'm a big believer that public land should really be used for public purposes. And I am a very big believer that if there is anyone who is seeking to develop the land and seeking to do it in a way that requires the mayor or the city council or the community to be involved, that we are making sure that whatever the end result of that process is truly something that affords benefits to the local community and also solves the problem. And I think what we're seeing here in New York City, we can all agree that the core issue that we face in terms of land use is, of course, affordable housing. We have had lots of really well-intentioned attempts to address this issue. And I think, unfortunately, they have failed. They failed for a couple of reasons. In some ways, I think they failed as a result of a lack of leadership and political will. And in some ways, they have failed because our process for dealing with these issues is, in fact, broken. And when we think about the idea that our guiding principle around land use should be that we should truly create housing that is truly affordable for those people who need it the most, I think fidelity to that principle means that we need to really assess every project that's proposed through that lens, because I think we can all agree that more additional housing needs to be created. And so that brings us to the process itself, right? And the process in this case, I think when ULURP was initially designed, it was thought to be a process that truly did allow for sufficient, community involvement. The reality of the situation is that the way the process is structured and the way it's played out over now the last several decades is that developers essentially pre-negotiate every aspect of a deal with the City Planning Commission, with the mayor, sometimes with the council member, and they spend an enormous amount of time and money figuring something out that they think is going to be able to go through the community process and get to where they want to go. The problem, the very obvious glaring problem here, is that by the time that any sort of proposal gets to the actual community board, the whole thing has been baked, and the community didn't actually have the opportunity to have a seat at the table early on enough in the process to say, okay, what is this development all about? Is it meeting a citywide need? Is it meeting a local need? What are all of the attendant features to this development that are going to need to happen in order for it to be something that we can actually sustain? Is it environmentally sustainable? What are the infrastructure implications? Is there sufficient transportation that allows for this development? Are there sufficient sewers that allow for this development? There are all of these questions. And while the Department of City Planning is in some ways well equipped to answer them, the reality is that without having the community at the table right from the very beginning, the process itself is never going to produce a proposal that people are going to be happy with. And so what we have are, we find ourselves embroiled in these lengthy and painful arguments and disagreements about the nature and the scale and the use of all of these developments. And it's because we never set up the process to ensure that we could actually answer these critical questions right at the front. And so for me, a really critical priority is going to be reforming the land use process, the ULURP process, to ensure that the community has a very proactive and substantial and meaningful seat at the table right at the very beginning.
How would you do that in terms of the mechanics of it? I mean, city planning puts together, environmental impact assessments and statements, etc., before the whole thing is certified. Is that where you'd want the public to get involved at that point, or how would you sort of go about this?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the fact that there isn't a formal community board review until after city planning really certifies a proposal, I think is exactly the problem. I think that community board review needs to come earlier. I think there needs to be an open and honest discussion between the developer and the community about what it is that we are truly seeking to accomplish. And I think part of the city planning process needs to be a much deeper, and community-focused evaluation of what the ultimate result is going to be of this particular development. Is the housing sufficiently affordable? If it is not, that should not continue to go through the process. If we are not actually solving the affordable housing crisis by having a lengthy back and forth over a particular development, then we need to really look at where that development is starting. And one very important point here is that I think when it comes to any development at all, we are the city of New York. We need to be leading with our values, and we need to be negotiating from the front. So when you're talking about housing, we need to make sure that the housing is in fact affordable and there are sufficient set-asides for our neighbors experiencing homelessness. When we're talking about commercial or development that is supposedly creating jobs, great, we need jobs. We have something like 14% unemployment right now. But I want to make sure that if we are creating jobs, that we are not negotiating against ourselves. So what does that mean? We mean that the jobs need to pay good wages, not just 10,000 jobs at the minimum wage. Those jobs need to offer a true ladder for growth, which means that there is sufficient training that is involved in the workforce, so the workforce can in fact grow into their careers. You know, I am personally the beneficiary of a family in which both of my parents started out earning very little money, but my mother, as a public servant in the state mental health system, and my father is an engineer, were really able to grow into their careers and be able, you know, they didn't become rich, but they were able to provide a stable life for our family, despite the fact that they were immigrants and came to New York with very little. And so it's that type of ladder for growth that I think we as a city of New York need to really, you know, it's that principle we need to be leading with when we're thinking about job creation. And that plays a very, very clear role in how we are treating any sort of proposal that's coming from anyone to create jobs, right? And then of course, there are all the issues of the environment, you know, and I think the way we think about development when it comes to the environment, when it comes to infrastructure, is just backwards. We always think about build the thing first, then have the environmental and infrastructure upgrades come in later. That's backwards. If we expect that there are going to be parcels of land that might one day be, you know, suitable for development because housing is needed, let's say, or employment is needed, well, the city of New York, working with the state and its federal partners, and we certainly hope that we're going to have better federal partners now, needs to also really have a clear vision for what that infrastructure looks like, and needs to make sure that infrastructure is going to be sustainable, because we can lead with infrastructure first as opposed to leading with development first, because when we do that, we're always going to be behind the curve. So that's just a little bit about my philosophy on development.
Great. Now, there's a couple of projects right now that are being discussed. Tonight, the Land Use Committee of Community Board 2 is going to be discussing the FIPS project on Barnett Avenue in Sunnyside. It's 100% affordable housing. There are issues with FIPS as a management company. Where do you weigh in on that? That's 100% affordable. There's, I think, 15% is available for formerly homeless. What are your thoughts in assessing that, and what conclusion have you come up with at this point?
It's a great question. So I'm going to return to my values and my guiding principles here. I do believe that more affordable housing is needed, and I also believe that more affordable housing cannot be created out of thin air. It has to be built. So I think we need to be very honest with ourselves about the fact that if we're going to solve the city's affordable housing crisis, which, by the way, impacts Black, brown, and immigrant New Yorkers, you know, much more acutely than it does anyone else, that we're going to have to build it. I will say that there are things about this particular proposal that I think are improvements from the 2016 proposal. 2016 proposal, certainly from my perspective, was almost offensive in terms of the affordability levels that it was offering. I do agree that it was a little bit out of character for the neighborhood to propose something that was, you know, 12 stories high. And I also will say that I have deep concerns about the neighborhood's ability to sustain this project from, in particular, a transportation perspective, and also from an education perspective. You know, anyone who gets on the train at 52nd Street or 46th Street, or God help you, 40th Street, you know, pre-COVID, will tell you that very often on weekday mornings, if you're trying to get to work and you work in Manhattan, you have to let 1 or 2 or sometimes 3 trains go by before you can actually get on the train. So adding, you know, this level of density, I think, is a concern for sure. At the same time, I think offering a 15% set aside for neighbors experiencing homelessness, I think, is a notable improvement. I will tell you, as someone who has worked extensively on the issue of poverty and homelessness, has really seen it from the inside. One of the biggest challenges that we have had as a city is that developers have refused to work with us on the set aside issue. And we've also had a lack of political leadership on this issue in terms of forcing developers to have that set aside. We're never going to solve the affordable housing crisis unless we also solve the crisis of homelessness. The crisis of homelessness is a product of the affordable housing crisis. And so therefore the plan to solve homelessness must be one and the same as the plan to build and create and preserve affordable housing. They cannot be two different things, as they have been in the last several years. So I think from that perspective, there are things about this project that are certainly notable improvements. I remain very concerned about the complaints, the very large number of complaints that we've gotten about FIPS as a landlord. You know, the fact that there are so many people from the Sunnyside Gardens development who have come out and really, you know, expressed some grave concern in great detail, does raise a question to me in terms of, you know, what type of management will FIPS be providing, and I also want to know, given that this is a new development, granted it's 100% affordable, is this going to be a shiny new object and Phipps does a great job here, whereas across the street, they're still not meeting the needs? And so I have not heard a sufficient amount from Phipps to really understand how they're going to address those concerns. I certainly want to hear more from them about that. And I also think that if I had my druthers, instead of going up to 110% AMI, this really would cap out at 100%. I think, where we are right now with the economic situation that we're facing in the city, with the level of unemployment that we have, really creating deeper levels of affordability that truly make housing accessible to New Yorkers, not $2,100 studios that we've seen in Long Island City advertised as affordable. That's where we need to be going. So those are the types of things I want to see still coming out of this conversation.
All right. Now, another project I want to bring up is Annabelle Basin in Long Island City, where the Amazon campus was once proposed. There were some plans earlier in the year about developing a big chunk down there with TF Cornerstone, Plaxel, a couple of other companies as well. What were your thoughts on that? I mean, it seems to have been abandoned with the public space where TF Cornerstone is going to develop being removed. But what was your overall thoughts on that? I mean, there were 50% of the building area was going to be for jobs. And then, of course, there were going to be about 6,000 to 7,000 apartment units. It seems as though it's been shelved, but what were your thoughts on it anyway?
Once again, I go back to my guiding principles on this. Are we creating housing that is truly affordable for New Yorkers in need? And are we creating jobs that offer dignity and a ladder for growth? I don't know if that proposal really had sufficient detail to give me a sense that we were accomplishing either of these goals. Okay. I don't know, from my perspective, whatever I've seen about the proposals does not give me confidence that that proposal offered to develop affordable housing in any sort of sufficient way. It is really unclear to me what employment was going to look like by the quote unquote jobs that were being proposed. It seemed to me, based on the details that were available, that once again, we were going to see a situation where jobs were being created at a very high level, and to support those higher level jobs, there were going to be a mass of service jobs, paying minimum wage or just a little bit over minimum wage. That's not the type of economy that I'm interested or willing in supporting. New York City has been the home of innovation and of the middle class for now, more than 100 years, and millions of people have come from all over the United States and all over the world to build better lives here for their families, build more equitable lives for their families, because New York City has been the place that has offered them the opportunity to do that and really lead lives with dignity. Okay. If we're just creating a massive amount of jobs that aren't actually offering Black, brown, and immigrant New Yorkers a pathway into the middle class and to be able to fully participate in the economy, all we're doing is strengthening those very problematic intergenerational cycles of poverty. And that's something that the city of New York has to take leadership in breaking. We, the city, are not going to overnight be able to, on our own, sufficiently regulate the excesses of market capitalism in ways that, tries to break its bones and make it work for us. But there is a lot we can do to make sure that if our imprimatur is required, if the community's permission is required, if the public's permission is required to be able to do something, that there are true benefits being accorded to the public. And that is not something that I saw in that proposal. And one last quick point on that, I stand behind this very strongly. Public land must be used for public purposes. So, I am not entirely clear on what exactly, there was some, it was an interesting proposal because I think they were saying that there was going to be, quite a lot of publicly accessible space created as a part of that, which is good. I think that's helpful. But if in doing so, you are also building a lot of housing that is unaffordable, and you are also creating a lot of jobs that perhaps aren't offering economic stability and mobility, then I'm not sure that that's the best use of the public land. So that's where I have come down on that particular issue.
Great. So look, moving along, the police, the NYPD, $6 billion budget, discussions of cutting the budget, defunding the cops, I guess. What are your thoughts on the police, the NYPD? what are your thoughts on the NYPD, and what changes do you recommend, and what would you do to the budget?
Sure. Well, first of all, a guiding principle for me here is that public safety should not publicly terrorize. I mean, it is just unconscionable that we have seen far too many instances historically, and even more recently, of the NYPD not, in fact, supporting and building public safety and build public trust, but rather, serving as a force that really has undermined trust in communities and undermine trust in itself. I think a lot of New Yorkers, particularly Black, brown, and immigrant New Yorkers, when they see a police officer, I don't know if they necessarily feel safe, or if they feel protected, or if they feel like that person is really looking out for their interests. And I'm not talking about an individual officer and what they, may view, or how they view their work. I'm saying it's more about what they represent. At this stage, we are at a point where I think for a lot of New Yorkers, I would argue for the majority of New Yorkers, the police force does not represent a force for good. And so that desperately needs to change. And this is not something that is a new issue. I mean, this is obviously the result of 400 years of structural racism. And, it's even here in New York City, a city where we think, that there is more diversity, and that there is, greater access to opportunity for people from all backgrounds. The fact that we have had policing that has criminalized and terrorized Black and brown men in particular has meant that we have not been able to build a city that truly offers equal opportunity for all. So how do we change this? Well, first of all, I think when it comes to the NYPD's budget, we need to divest from all that is broken and reinvest those funds in all that we know will work. So what does this mean in practice? A couple of things. If you look at just one day of the NYPD's operating budget, which is $16.5 million, if you were to reduce the NYPD's operating budget by just one day, or reallocate those funds, you could send 2,300 New York City high school seniors to CUNY for 1 year for free. Or you could provide more than 300 small businesses with $50,000 in loans each. Or you could fund more than 822,000 hours of youth employment at $20 an hour. When we've seen this, the council and the mayor have fights over, and communities and the mayor have fights over cutting youth employment budgets like we did this past summer. When there is outcry from hundreds of thousands of students across the city about the fact that they can't continue to afford their tuition at CUNY. When CUNY is laying off their adjunct faculty. I think we've got to really ask ourselves, what type of a city and what type of a society are we building? With that, even just that one day, 3/65 of the annual budget of the NYPD, if we could accomplish so much, what could we accomplish at 5 times that or 10 times that? And so that's really the conversation that I think we need to be having. We need to do a very, very deep dive on the NYPD's budget and really look at what's not working. And it starts with taking weapons of war off our streets. The NYPD post 9/11, I'm a native New Yorker. I was born and raised in the city, I've been here 35 years. It's become increasingly militarized. There is equipment that the NYPD has that costs hundreds of millions of dollars. That's the same equipment that the United States Army has. I'm sorry, the NYPD does not need the same types of machinery and weapons that are used to fight wars right here on the streets. The wars should not be fought, period. They certainly don't need to be fought in Sunnyside, Woodside, Long Island City, and Astoria. And so these are, some really critical issues that we have to be looking at. And I think it does start with the budget.
Okay.
I also think we need to make sure that as we are looking at how we are divesting from the NYPD, that we are also really investing in creating an entirely new community infrastructure for how the city responds to all sorts of challenging issues. When it comes to this idea of the city having to respond to, quote, emotionally disturbed persons, or to certain types of domestic disputes, or to wellness checks, or, certain types of traffic stops. There is no reason why we need to be sending someone in with a baton and a gun and handcuffs to be able to respond to what in many cases or most instances are truly mental health crises. So we need to take a very significant chunk of the NYPD's budget. We need to reinvested in a true mental health response corps that really has people who are sufficiently trained and have the right types of access to also the right supports when it comes to the law. We're going to really need to look at changes at both the state and city level to make sure that when we do develop this type of corps, that the law is actually protecting of the work that they do, right? And the NYPD can't just come in and supersede them. And so this is going to be work that takes a long time. We're not going to be able to do this overnight. And in order to do it well, we're going to need to make sure that communities are fully 100% a part of the process. The communities that have truly suffered the most at the hands of the NYPD need to be the communities that are leading the process to reform the NYPD, divest from it, and reinvest back into the communities.
Great, Amit, great. Moving to transportation. Transportation in Western Queens. Do you think there needs to be changes in terms of, I don't know, greater access for cyclists and pedestrians? What do you think needs to be done to bus service and, say, the subway? What are your thoughts on Western Queens in general in terms of access to transportation?
So, Western Queens is blessed in some ways, right? We do have more transit access than a lot of other parts of the city. But as we all know, Western Queens has also seen more development as a neighborhood, generally speaking, or as an area, generally speaking, than almost any other part of the country. 9,500 units of housing were created between 2010 and 2018. And at the end of 2018, an additional 5,500 were planned. Now, we don't know how many of those will ultimately come to fruition. Obviously, the current economic crisis is going to have an impact there. But if you think about that, and if you think about the fact that the average household size in New York City is 2.4 people, according to the United States Census, you're talking about something like 23,000 people added in a relatively short period of time, just to Long Island City, let alone any of the growth you might have seen in Sunnyside, Woodside, or the southern sliver of Astoria. So of course, what this means is that this has placed an enormous strain on our infrastructure at every level, including and most especially our transit infrastructure. I spoke a little bit about the incredible difficulty that Sunnyside and Woodside residents have, being able to get on the 7 train and during the morning rush hour. What I want to see is that before we talk about additional development in Western Queens, that we are first having a conversation about how to improve our transit access and transit infrastructure. Do we need to be looking as an initial matter for an LIRR stop in Sunnyside, right? Irrespective of what ends up happening with Sunnyside Yards or not, the reality of the situation is that if we do go back to an economy with the type of levels of employment that we had and also the office culture that we had, we're not going to be able to sustain even the type of crush that was being experienced on the 7 train. And so that immediately raises the question of how do we alleviate some of those issues in Sunnyside and Woodside. When it comes to pedestrians and bikes, big issues here. First and foremost, I think we need to significantly expand bike access to the bridge. The South Outer Roadway does need to be pedestrianized and, have much more space for a bigger and safer bike lane. Mm-hmm. As someone who has biked across the Queensboro Bridge many, many, many times, I can tell you it is a little harrowing, not just for me as a biker, but more so for pedestrians. And the reality is that if we want a more sustainable future, we can and should be moving much more towards biking as a critical form of transport. It is good that the city of New York over the past few administrations has, significantly expanded the bike lane network. I want to see more of that happen. We are a city in which as many people as possible should be biking because we should not be in our cars to the greatest extent possible, not possible for everyone, but to the greatest extent possible. And if we can alleviate some of the pressures on, a subway system that was built more than 100 years ago, that's going to be really important to making sure that we can also plan for a sustainable future and a future where there is going to be some growth. Okay. And so making sure that there is that bike access is critically important, and expanding bike access in general across the district. City Bike is a very good example of this. City Bike is currently really only available in Long Island City and parts of Astoria. We need to expand it across Sunnyside and Woodside. Some of those bike lanes do exist, significantly underutilized as a result of City Bike not being available. And last quick point, when it comes to pedestrians, Improvements, of course, have been made to Queens Boulevard in the last couple of years. More improvements can be done. And I think we need to take a very hard look at what's going on Northern Boulevard. The stretch of Northern Boulevard that's in this district is obviously not particularly residential, but pedestrians use it all the time. And, the fact that it has not undergone the same safety improvements that parts of Queens Boulevard have undergone mean that it is also not safe when we decide that perhaps, there is going to be a need for there to be a lot more pedestrianization there. So we need to be thinking proactively and looking to the future about roadways such as that, and saying, how do we actually truly make them safer places for our city's residents?
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be a lot more residential development on Northern Boulevard, so you're going to certainly see a lot more pedestrians down there. Yeah. Community board appointments. How would you go about appointing people to the boards?
Sure. So this is, another feature of New York City government that I think does need a lot of reform. I've worked in and out of government here in New York City for almost 15 years. And what I have seen with respect to community boards is that, with community boards, very often there are some incredibly dedicated community leaders who are true experts on the various issues in their communities that really have a lot to meaningfully contribute to the community board and all of its processes. And there are others who perhaps, are on community boards simply as the result of political patronage and are there to, silently or sometimes publicly represent key interests. The first thing we need to do to make sure that community boards truly are reflective of the needs of the community and are responsive to the needs of the community is to democratize the process. I think this starts just as an initial matter with making sure that everyone who lives in this district even knows what the community boards are. One of the things that we have seen as a feature of civic life, a real deficiency in civic life here in New York City for decades, this is nothing new, is that we as New Yorkers do not participate in our politics and in our civic life in the way that people do in other parts of the country. And there are lots of reasons for this. We don't have time for all of that today. We have seen a significant shift in this deficiency. We have seen an improvement in the last several years. And I think part of that is because we're finally starting to see political leadership in the city that is willing to actually represent the true interests of New Yorkers, willing to address the true needs of New Yorkers, willing to bring bold progressive vision to solving these critical problems when it comes to employment and economy and housing and what have you. And so the community boards really need to be a part of that. We need to make sure that we're bringing the community boards along. So as just an initial matter, I think it starts with making sure that we are putting public dollars behind advertising what the community boards are, how they function, and inviting people to apply. This means working with immigrant communities. Immigrant communities are always significantly underrepresented on the community board. And it is because immigrant communities have never, the city of New York has never made a concerted effort to actually bring immigrant communities into the process. And so if you look at the burgeoning South Asian community in Sunnyside and Woodside, Bangladeshis and Nepalis and Tibetans, totally underrepresented on community board too, right? And why is that? It's because communities have not actually been activated and educated around this. So that's, making sure that communities know what the process is, bringing the youth in. Youth are incredibly important, right here in our local high schools. We have an enormous opportunity to, in the same breath as we are educating about youth, about the importance of the right to vote and the importance of voting, saying, and this is how you get involved locally. This is how, local civic engagement actually is completely aligned with and is in fact the building block of, you being able to walk into the ballot box and cast your vote, right? And when you start to do that, I think we're going to start to immediately see that the community boards are more diverse, more diverse in terms of ethnic makeup, of racial makeup, of gender makeup, of people of different sexual orientations and gender identities, and diverse in terms of age, which I think is a really, really important issue. I think as we look, community boards play such an enormous role in figuring out what the future is going to look like, and I think we really need to make sure that there are folks on the board who are going to really be living as part of that future, and balance that with the true experience that is also required to serve on the board in a meaningful way.
How would you do that though? I mean, would you be in charge of the appointments 50-50%, like half of the borough president, half of you doing the appointments? or are you looking at a whole different concept in terms of bringing people on?
Well, I think we need to explore a new concept of bringing people on. I think simply being appointed by a council member or a borough president is honestly not the democratic way to do things. I know there are a lot of proposals that have been put out there. I know some folks have talked about, holding full-on elections for community boards. There are other proposals that have been floated. I think this is an area that requires, some really serious consideration. There's no question that the process needs to be significantly democratized. I think there are some really important issues that we need to look at with respect to the city charter and also law in terms of how we go about this. And I think we need to ask ourselves the question of if we are going to, in fact, have community boards, be decision-making bodies where people are elected to them, what does that mean in terms of their actual power? As of right now, community they come to is non-binding.
Right.
Well, if you're holding an election to elect 50 members of a community board, do you really want to hold an election to elect 50 members of the community who are then actually not going to be able to have a say in, or make decisions where the decisions are not binding, right? So I think the entire process needs to be looked at. There's no question that the guiding principle needs to be diversification and democratization. I think that has to be the goal. How exactly we get there, I think, is a conversation we need to have, and we need to have, with communities.
Yeah. I mean, 50 elections would be a lot of elections. All right. Well, listen.
That's exactly right.
Thank you very much for your time today, and really nice to meet you.
Thank you so much, Christian, and really nice to meet you as well. And I hope to speak with you again soon.